The cold came for the Voss
Are you
family 3 winters
awake?
running before it finally took Henrik.
It's
Not
so
all at once,
cold.
that would have been merciful, the kind of clean ending a man could prepare for. Instead, it came the way debt comes incrementally, invisibly, until the morning you open the strongbox and find nothing left. The first winter stripped the color from Henrik's face. The second winter stripped the weight from his shoulders. The third winter stripped the rest, and by February of 1883, he was in the ground on the south slope of Harrow Ridge, buried in soil so frozen the men who dug for him had to build fires against the earth just to soften it enough for their picks to bite. Ingrid Voss was 15 years old the morning they lowered her father into that reluctant ground, and she stood at the edge of the hole with her hands folded inside her coat sleeves and watched the steam rise from the thawing earth, and thought about how wrong it was that the ground had to be warmed before it would accept a man who had spent his last 3 years slowly freezing to death inside it. She did not cry. She had learned somewhere in the machinery of that third winter that crying was a transaction. You gave something of yourself to the cold air and received nothing in return. The cold did not care about tears. It absorbed them the same way it absorbed everything else a family tried to hold on to heat. Hope, the particular warmth that lived in a man's hands when he pressed them against his children's cheeks to check for fever. Her mother stood on the other side of the grave with Otto pressed against her hip, the boy's face buried in the wool of her coat. Maren Voss was 34 years old, narrow through the shoulders, but not fragile, with hands already roughened past what most women her age showed, and a face that gave you its attention without giving you its thoughts. She watched the men lower Henrik with the expression of someone reading a document they had been expecting for some time. Not surprised, not yet broken, simply marking the moment as the official end of one set of calculations and the beginning of another. The gravediggers were careful with him. They had respected Henrik Voss. Most men in Greystone Basin did in the particular way frontier men respect someone who works without complaint until he cannot work anymore. He had built their cabin in the summer of 1878, raised it fast the way every man raised his first house in that country, fast against the coming cold, promising himself he would go back and do it properly. Come spring. Spring came 5 times. The chinking was never finished. There was always a fence line down, always a field that needed breaking, always something more urgent than the gaps in the walls that let the Wyoming wind whisper through the dark hours while his family slept in their coats. Ingrid had memorized those gaps. She knew each one by the particular sound it made: the high, thin whistle above the east window, the low moan that ran along the floor seam near the wood stove, the irregular tapping above her sleeping pallet that she had spent 2 winters believing was some small animal, before she understood it was simply wind finding its way through a wall that had never been properly sealed. She knew them the way you know the sounds of a sick person's breathing, intimately, anxiously, always listening for the change that meant something had gotten worse. The morning after the burial, she woke before the others and lay still in the gray pre-dawn light, counting the familiar sounds. The east window whistled. The floor seam moaned. The tapping above her head tapped. Outside, the temperature had dropped again overnight, and the cabin walls did what they always did in deep cold. They contracted slightly, drawing the gaps a fraction wider, letting another sliver of February into the room. The wood stove in the corner had burned down to coals while they slept. Ingrid could see her own breath suspended above her face in the lampless dark, a thin white thread that appeared and dissolved and appeared again with each exhale. She turned her head toward Otto's sleeping pallet. The boy was curled small beneath his blanket. Both blankets, actually, because sometime in the night she had moved one of her own coverings across the room and laid it over him without waking him. His hair, dark like their father's, had a faint crystalline quality at the edges, where his breath had frozen against the fabric of the pillow during the night. Not dramatically, not the hard frost you could scrape away with a fingernail. Just the suggestion of it, the way cold leaves its signature on surfaces it has touched long enough to claim. She did not tell her mother about Otto's hair. Her mother already knew. That was the kind of knowledge that lived in the Voss house like a fourth family member, the knowledge of exactly how bad things were and exactly how little saying so aloud would change them. Maren was already awake, already at the table with a stub of pencil and the back pages of a seed catalog. Ingrid watched her from across the room, the particular stillness of a woman doing arithmetic she did not want to do. Her lips pressed together, her pencil moving in small, deliberate marks. The strongbox sat open beside the catalog. Ingrid did not need to count what was in it. She had counted it herself 3 days ago when she was looking for the button tin. $47 and some coins. Everything the Voss family had. Her mother worked at the arithmetic for a long time. The pencil stopped moving. The strongbox stayed open. Outside, something cracked in the cold, a branch probably, or the corner post of the fence line Henrik had been meaning to reinforce since October. The sound came sharp and flat in the frozen air like a gunshot with nothing behind it, and then the silence rushed back in and was total. Maren closed the seed catalog. She closed the strongbox. She sat for another moment with both hands flat on the table and looked at the wall of the cabin. Not the wall exactly, but through it at something on the other side that no one else in the room could see. Ingrid recognized that look. It was the look her mother got when she had already made a decision and was giving herself a final moment to reconsider before she stopped reconsidering. "Go back to sleep," Maren said without turning from the wall. Ingrid did not go back to sleep. 3 days later, Maren Voss rode into Dunmore and did not go to the lumberyard. She rode past Harlan Fitch's yard with its stacked and seasoned pine, past the mill with its smell of fresh-cut wood, past the hardware store, where a sensible widow would have begun purchasing the materials to patch the cabin that her husband had left her. She rode to the land office at the end of Main Street, where a man named Doyle kept records on parcels that no one in Greystone Basin particularly wanted. She asked about the ruins on Harrow Ridge. The stone fort had been built by the Army in 1859, during the years of the Indian troubles, on a low rise above Bitter Creek, where the ground gave a clear sight line in 3 directions. The soldiers had abandoned it in 1864, when a better crossing opened 20 miles west, and in the 19 years since the structure had received nothing but weather. The walls still stood 2 feet thick, where the freeze-thaw cycles hadn't crumbled the corners. Fitted stone laid by men who knew their trade, now gone to moss in the joints, and grass growing from the gaps where the mortar had powdered out a generation ago. The land agent Doyle had practically apologized while describing it, assuming she wanted the acreage and would tear the stone down for a root cellar or a well house. Maren walked the perimeter of the ruins twice, while Doyle waited by the buggy, checking his pocket watch, with the expression of a man certain he was watching an afternoon waste itself. She ran her hand along the courses. She knelt and looked at how the lowest stones met the earth. Then she pressed her palm flat against the southern face, where the pale March sun had been sitting since mid-morning, and held it there. The air had a bite to it. The stone did not. The stone held the day's thin warmth the way certain people hold their composure in a crisis. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, but with a steadiness that made everything around it seem more chaotic by comparison. The warmth rose through her palm and into her wrist, and she stood very still. Her eyes on the middle distance. Her expression, something that Doyle would later describe to men at the Dunmore feed store as the most unsettling thing he had witnessed all year. A woman finding something in a pile of old government rubble that she had apparently been looking for her entire life. She bought the deed the next morning. $47 in the coins. Ingrid found out the way she found out most things. Her mother decided not by being told, but by watching the strongbox go from open to empty to put away entirely the absence of money, more eloquent than any announcement. Maren explained it that evening over cornmeal and the last of the salt pork, the ruins on Harrow Ridge, the stone walls, the principle of heat and rock that her father had taught her in the limestone country of Kansas, before the marriage, before the basin, before any of this. She explained it clearly without apology or excess, the way she explained most things, as though the logic were self-evident once you had the right information. Otto wanted to know about buried treasure and soldier buttons. His eyes went wide and greedy with the romance of it, and Maren let him have that for a moment, which was generous of her under the circumstances. Ingrid set down her spoon and asked the only question that seemed to matter: were they going to have to move before winter? When her mother said yes, Ingrid picked up her spoon again and ate the rest of her cornmeal and did not ask anything else. She had learned very young that asking questions you already knew the answers to was a way of spending energy you could not afford. That night, after Maren banked the stove and Otto's breathing settled into the long, slow rhythm of sleep, Ingrid lay on her pallet and stared at the ceiling and thought about her Aunt Ruth in St. Louis. Aunt Ruth lived in a brick house on a street with gas lamps, and when Ingrid had visited at age 7 before the basin, before the worst winters, she had stood in the parlor on a Sunday morning and watched colored light fall through the church window across the street and land in red and blue shapes on the clean wooden floor. And she had understood in some wordless way that there were places in the world where light itself was different, where warmth was not something a family had to fight for every single night against a cold that did not care whether they won. She did not write the letter yet, but she thought about writing it. The Basin learned of it within the week, as the Basin learned everything through the general store, through the feed mill, through the particular velocity of information in a small community where most people had known each other long enough to take real pleasure in each other's mistakes. A widow had bought the old fort on Harrow Ridge. A widow meant to live in it. Not in a proper cabin she would raise beside the ruins, using the stone for a windbreak or a root cellar, but inside the ruin itself, behind 2-foot thick walls of cold gray government stone, with 2 children and a Wyoming winter coming. The verdict assembled without a trial. Ezra Calloway heard it at the feed store on a Tuesday. He was 58 years old, broad through the shoulders, still with hands that had built more sound roofs in Greystone Basin than any other man living. Hands that knew the difference between a green beam and a seasoned one by touch, that could read a corner joint the way a doctor reads a pulse. His word about a roof line had weight in this valley that no other man's signature on a contract could match. When Ezra Calloway approved of something, men built it. When he did not, they changed their plans. He did not say much at the feed store. He was not a man who said much when he was thinking. He listened to the story, the widow, the ruins, the $47, the walls that would pull the warmth out of a family faster than they could feed the fire. And he turned it over in his mind the way he turned over a board he was considering for a specific cut, examining it for the flaw that would make it dangerous. Then he rode out to Harrow Ridge on a Thursday afternoon, not because he was cruel, but because he believed telling a person the truth before they made an expensive mistake was the most useful form of courtesy available in a country this unforgiving. He found Marin Voss kneeling beside a shallow pit, mixing something in the dirt with a short-handled spade. Lime-crushed, shale-dried grass fiber worked together until it took the color of wet ash. Her sleeves were pushed up past the elbow. Her hair was tied back under a faded kerchief. There was lime dust white in the creases of her knuckles and a streak of it across one cheekbone, where she had pushed a loose strand away from her face with the back of her wrist. She did not rise when his shadow fell across the pit. She had heard the horse. She had decided somewhere in the previous week that she would not stop her hands for any man who came to watch her fail. Calloway watched her for a long moment. He had a craftsman's appreciation for work done with precision, and even setting aside the question of whether this particular project was sound, there was something in the deliberateness of her movements, the economy of motion, the way she tested the mixture's consistency before committing to the next addition that demanded a different kind of attention than he had expected to give. His chest tightened slightly around a conclusion he hadn't wanted to reach quite so quickly. This was not a woman who had lost her judgment to grief. This was a woman who had made a specific decision based on a specific principle, and whether the principle was correct or not, the decision was not the work of someone unmoored. He said what he had come to say nonetheless, because the principle was wrong regardless of how clearly she held it. Stone belonged under a house, not around it. He had seen stone foundations sweat and freeze and crack the floors above them. He had seen what cold did to rock when water got into the seams, the way it expanded, worked, pried apart joints that had been mortared solid. He was not telling her this to be unkind. He was telling her because it was true, and because he had built his reputation in this valley on telling true things to people who needed to hear them, and he would not make an exception for the fact that she was a widow, or that the telling of it would cost her something. Marin pressed a trowel of her mixture into a gap between 2 courses of stone, smoothed it with her thumb, picked up another trowelful. Her thumb did not hesitate. "This wall keeps yesterday alive." Her voice carried across the distance between them, even in tone, without the weight of argument in it. Nothing more. She let the sentence stand without explanation. She did not tell him about the limestone kilns in Kansas, about her father's hands, about the morning she had stood at age 8 before a dead fire and felt yesterday's warmth still living in the stone. She had learned from years of being the daughter of a man in a trade that other men looked down on, from years of being the wife of a man whose cabin everyone else quietly considered below standard, that explaining a principle to someone who has already decided you are wrong only gives them more to argue with. Evidence was the only language that moved people who had already made up their minds, and the evidence was not ready yet. Calloway rode back toward Dunmore with the sentence in his ear. He could not fit it neatly into the category of things foolish women said when they did not understand how cold actually worked. He tried because putting it there would have been convenient. It did not fit. Harlan Fitch heard the story that evening and calculated as Harlan Fitch calculated everything in board feet. The widow had $47 that could have bought a load of his best seasoned pine, and instead she had given it to Doyle at the land office for a pile of government rubble that would be a liability in January. The waste of it offended him in the way waste always offended him personally, as though she had reached into his yard and taken the lumber she refused to buy and simply set it on fire. He stood by the cold stove at the feed store the following Saturday and laid out the arithmetic for anyone who would listen, which was most of the men in the room, because Fitch's arithmetic had the comfortable authority of numbers written in a ledger, and numbers in a ledger were easier to trust than principles you couldn't see. Calvin Sprague heard Fitch's arithmetic and improved on it the way he improved on everything, by finding the phrase that would travel. He had ridden out to Harrow Ridge himself on the pretext of checking whether the ruins sat on the creek floodplain, which they did not, but which gave him a legitimate reason to have been there. He had looked at the half-mortared walls at the 2-foot thickness of stone that a family was apparently planning to substitute for pine in insulation and the ordinary logic of frontier construction, and he had found his phrase before he was back in the saddle. Voss's icebox. He offered it at the feed store with the practiced casualness of a man setting down a card he knows will take the hand. The laughter that followed was easy and certain. The laughter of a community confirmed in what it had already suspected that grief had done to Marin Voss, what grief sometimes did to people out here, which was to unhinge the sensible calculation that kept a family alive through a Wyoming winter and replace it with a widow's desperate notion dressed up as principle. The name reached Ingrid on a Wednesday morning in early April. She had walked the 3 miles into Dunmore for flour, counting the coins twice in her coat pocket before she left, because money had grown tight enough that the counting mattered. 2 women she recognized from church were behind her in the line at the general store, and they were not unkind. That was the particular cruelty of it, that they had no intention of wounding her, were simply talking with the easy sympathy of people discussing a situation that was not their own. Voss's icebox, one of them said, and clucked her tongue, and the other made a sound that meant she agreed, and added that it was a shame about the children. A real shame, meaning specifically Ingrid and Otto, meaning that the children were to be pitied for having a mother whose grief had made her foolish. Ingrid paid for her flour. She walked the 3 miles home with the sack over her shoulder, and the coins counted twice now to nothing. She rehearsed somewhere in the long walk between Dunmore and Harrow Ridge what it would feel like to step onto a train in Dunmore and step off it in St. Louis and walk down a street with gas lamps to her Aunt Ruth's brick house on the other side of this particular life. That evening, she sat at the table after supper and took out the good paper the paper saved for correspondence, for things that actually needed to last, and uncapped the ink bottle. She got as far as the salutation. Dear Aunt Ruth, she wrote the date. She held the pen above the page and listened to the sounds coming through the cabin wall, the familiar sounds she had been listening to for 3 years. The east window, the floor seam, the tapping above her sleeping pallet. She capped the ink. She folded the paper and tucked it into the seam of her mattress where it could wait. Through April and into May, the work on Harrow Ridge went forward in the particular way frontier work went forward when a community had decided it was foolish, which was to say, without any help from the community. There were no barn-raising volunteers, no neighborly offers of an extra pair of hands for the heavy lifting. What the Voss family could do, the Voss family did. Otto discovered within the first week that searching Bitter Creek for flat stones was the best possible version of a job. He ranged up and down the creek bed with the single-minded enthusiasm of a boy who has been given permission to do exactly what he would have been doing anyway, loading the flat stones into a rough sledge his mother had knocked together from salvaged fort timber and hauling them up the slope in loads that were probably too heavy for a 9-year-old's arms. He did not complain about the weight. He called out when he found particularly good ones, flat ones, balanced ones, one that was almost exactly the shape of a soldier's hat, and brought them to his mother with the pride of someone contributing materially to an important enterprise. He did not yet understand that the valley was laughing at his mother. To him, Harrow Ridge was a fort which made it an adventure, which made the work a form of play that happened to be useful. Ingrid understood it completely, understood it every time she walked the creek road within sight of the rise, and felt the eyes of passing riders on her back, measuring the distance between what her mother was doing and what a sensible person would have done with $47. She carried water from Bitter Creek in 2 wooden buckets, 100 trips a day. the rope handles leaving rib marks in her palms that did not fade between morning and evening. She did it with her jaw set and her eyes on the path directly in front of her feet, because looking up meant seeing the riders on the road, and seeing the riders meant knowing they were watching. And knowing they were watching meant feeling the particular cold that had nothing to do with temperature, the cold that a community generates when it has decided someone among them is a cautionary tale. She had not opened the ink bottle again. The letter waited in the mattress seam. She was not ready to finish it, not because she had changed her mind, but because finishing it would mean committing to a future she could still, in the daylight hours, avoid committing to. The work moved forward in ways that no rider on the creek road could see. Marin started at the foundation the way her father would have, because her father had taught her that every failure in a wall begins at its base, and climbs that a builder who works from the top down will always find himself rebuilding from the ground up before he is finished. She pulled loose stones free and sorted them by weight and size, the large cornerstones in one pile, the fist-size fill in another. She dug a trench around the foundation, working through soil packed hard as kiln-fired clay, until her shoulders burned and her hands developed the particular calluses that come from work that does not accommodate hesitation. Fresh mortar went into each course, crushed shale for strength, lime for binding dried grass fiber to hold the mixture while it cured. A single section could eat a full day and leave nothing a passing stranger would notice. Marin measured her progress not in what showed, but in what she knew, the soundness climbing course by course out of the ground where no one from Dunmore would ever think to look for it. It was while clearing the trench along the eastern wall in late May that her spade struck something that rang wrong. Not the dull knock of buried stone, a hollow, fired note, a sound she knew in her marrow before her mind caught up to it, because it was the sound of her childhood, a spade against the outer wall of a lime kiln. She went down on her knees in the dirt and dug with her hands. Beneath the fort, older than the fort by perhaps a generation, lay the broken throat of a lime kiln. Its inner walls were scorched black. Its mouth was choked with a century of fallen earthgrass roots threading through the gaps. The whole thing settled into the ground, the way structures settle when the people who built them are gone, and the land reasserts its claim. She knelt over it for a long time while the sweat dried on her back, and Otto called to her from down the slope, and she did not answer. Someone had stood on this same rise before her, before the soldiers, before the fort, before any of the history that Greystone Basin thought of as its beginning, and had understood the same things she understood, had burned lime here, had known that fire could be stored in stone, had perhaps even built around a principle very close to the one she was building around now, had failed badly enough that the prairie had covered all evidence of the attempt, swallowed the proof, and presumably the people too, and left only this black-mouthed underground confession for a widow to find with her spade 75 years later. The discovery should have been comforting. She was not the first. The idea had survived long enough for someone else to attempt it before her. It did the opposite of comfort her. She sat back on her heels in the turned earth with a cold weight settling into her chest despite the May warmth, because she was not the first, and the first had lost. The question was no longer whether her principle was sound. She had pressed her palm to warm stone and felt her father's lessons confirmed in her own body, and she did not doubt the principle. The question now was why the people who came before her had believed the same thing she believed, with apparently the same conviction, and failed spectacularly enough that the earth had eaten their work whole. She did not know the answer. She had until the first hard freeze to find it. That night she lay on her pallet listening to her children breathe, and turned the buried kiln over in her mind, the way a tongue worries a cracked tooth, unable to leave it alone, unable to resolve it, the problem too close to examine clearly. Confidence was not what would save them. She saw that with a clarity that was almost physical. She had come up onto Harrow Ridge full of her father's teaching, and her own certainty and confidence was precisely what the dead builder beneath her feet had surely felt too, right up until the moment Wyoming proved him wrong. Only knowing why the dead had failed could keep her from repeating them. She did not yet know where to begin looking. The summer pressed on. Across Greystone Basin, the satisfying arithmetic of frontier progress advanced on schedule. Fresh logs stacked higher. New roof lines cut the horizon where there had been only sky. The solid week-by-week accumulation of structures that announced a family's intention to survive. A man could ride past a neighbor's homestead on a Monday and again on a Friday and measure the progress with his own eyes. He could ride past the Voss place on the same 2 days and swear the widow had spent the week moving the same stones from one pile to another and back again, accomplishing nothing a sensible eye could measure. Calloway rode past twice in June. He did not stop. Both times his horse's pace slowed slightly as he came level with the rise horses do that when something unusual catches their attention, and both times he let the animal slow for a moment before pressing on. He had no new information to offer the widow. He had said what he had come to say in April, and saying it again would not improve it. He did notice on the second ride by that the mortar work on the south face showed a refinement he had not expected. The courses were tighter. The stone placement demonstrated something about understanding load distribution that was not the work of someone operating on wishful thinking alone. He noticed this the way a craftsman notices another craftsman's improvement involuntarily against his will, with the particular irritation of having his professional eye report something his judgment would have preferred not to receive. He did not mention it to anyone. Sprague's nickname gained its own momentum through June and July, growing in the telling, the way a bad story always grows when there is no contrary evidence to check it. In one version, the walls were sinking back into the earth that bore them, settling an inch a week, so that come winter, only the chimney would show above the snow like a grave marker. In another, the widow had no plan for a roof at all, because who could roof a thing built on a principle that defied the basic mechanics of how warmth worked? By August, he was claiming that she meant to winter underground like a badger, which got the most laughter of any version because it required the least embellishment and carried the image people most wanted to hold in their minds. Fitch worked a quieter angle. He stood by the cold stove at the feed store and tallied board feet in the voice of a man sharing information reluctantly because the information pained him to share, and he felt a responsibility to share it anyway. The widow could have had a closed-in cabin by the first frost. He said sound pine, good dry stock, nothing fancy but tight enough to keep a family through a Wyoming January. The waste of it, stated as arithmetic, carried further than mockery because it wore the costume of concern. A man can half doubt a joke. A man cannot easily argue with a column of numbers that arrives wearing the face of sympathy. Calloway said the least. He never joined the stories at the feed store, never added his voice to Fitch's arithmetic. He only shook his head occasionally slowly when the widow's project came up in conversation. The particular slow headshake of a craftsman confronting an error in material or method, the same motion he used when a neighbor showed him a green beam or a corner cut where no corner should be cut. That small motion in his case carried the weight that Sprague's elaborate stories and Fitch's careful figures could never quite achieve, because the men of Greystone Basin had spent 15 years trusting Ezra Calloway's judgment about what would stand and what would fall. His silence on the subject of Marin Voss was a verdict. His occasional headshake was a sentence. The rain came in August without the courtesy of warning. There was no wall of dark on the western horizon, no iron smell in the wind, no stillness that settled over the birds to serve as advance notice. The cloud drifted in through the afternoon gray and low in total, and the rain that followed was not violent. No thunder, no wind, no drama. Just cold water falling hour after hour, the patient kind, the kind that does not knock down a wall, but finds its way beneath one working at the ground while a family sleeps. Marin was outside before the children woke, moving through the gray drizzle toward the walls, the way a mother moves toward a sick child in the night, half from worry, half from needing to see the worst with her own eyes, rather than imagine it in the dark. She saw the damage from 15 feet away. A section of fresh mortar along the lowest northern corner had washed clean away. Not collapsed, dissolved as though it had never existed. The joints between the stones laid bare, weeping dark water down the lower courses. Several stones along the bottom course had shifted outward, shouldered loose by the saturated ground where the land sloped. She could see it now. Now that failure had shown her what to look for, slightly, barely perceptibly toward the wall rather than away from it. She stood over it in the rain with the water running off the brim of her father's old hat and did not move for a long time. The failure was small. That was the cruelty of it. It did not need to be large to mean what it meant. A wound in the wrong place at the foundation, at the place where everything above it would eventually have to stand. Buck came padding through the wet grass to lower his nose to the soaked earth at the broken corner. Henrik's brown hound had transferred his allegiance to the whole family After Henrik died in the total way dogs transfer things completely without reservation. He breathed in the broken corner for a moment, then turned deliberately and walked several yards away to the eastern wall where the ground sloped correctly and lay down with his chin on his paws. The dog's small rejection said more than any man in Dunmore had managed to say all summer. The creature who had been sleeping against the sun-warmed southern wall every afternoon for 2 months had just voted on the failure with his body, the only honest vote available in Greystone Basin. Maren watched him resettle and felt the cold reach somewhere her wet clothes could not touch. Somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the worry in the place where her certainty had lived since April. Sprague rode past before noon, saw the slumped corner, and reached Dunmore with the story before the rain had stopped. Calloway himself rode out 2 days later when the ground had begun to firm under a pale sky. He swung down from his horse and crouched beside the broken section with the slow care of a man whose knees had opinions about cold mornings, and he studied the standing water in the trench, the dark water line on the lowest stones, the place where the ground gave softly under his boot heel when he pressed it. He took his time with it, reading the failure, the way he read a damaged roof, finding the story, the damage told working backward from consequence to cause. When he rose, his voice was level, almost gentle, which was the hardest thing she had faced since the burial. Water does what cold finishes. He touched the brim of his hat to her not unkindly and rode back toward town to a basin that already knew what he had found. For the first time since she had laid the first stone, Maren Voss stood before evidence that belief was not enough. Ingrid had allowed herself, without knowing she was doing it, to begin hoping. Not loudly, not the way you hope for something you expect to receive, but quietly, the way you maintain a small fire in a place you haven't decided to commit to, yet just enough to keep the possibility alive. Carrying water 100 trips a day, she had let something take root. She hadn't planned to plant the idea that the strange low house might actually stand, that they might not have to leave or freeze or beg, that her mother might be right. Watching the wall come apart under the rain was the price of having let herself almost believe. Half believing she was discovering had a much longer fall than never believing at all. She stood in the doorway of the ruined cabin while her mother began pulling the broken section down stone by stone, not in defeat, not in collapse, but with the same deliberate economy she brought to everything. The look of someone who has identified the error, corrected her understanding of it, and begun the work of correcting the error itself. The distinction between those two things, the error in the work versus the error in the thinking, was invisible from the doorway. To Ingrid, it looked like watching her mother dismantle the last argument against leaving. That evening she took out the good paper. She uncapped the ink. She read the salutation she had written in April. Dear Aunt Ruth, and the date, and then she wrote the single sentence she had been carrying since the morning they thawed the ground to bury her father, that she did not think they would last the winter. That she wanted to come. She wrote it. She held the pen above it for a moment. She listened to the sounds coming through the wall, except now it was not the cabin wall with its familiar whistles and moans, but the stone wall of the ruin still standing where the damage had not reached, absolutely silent in the night air. Stone did not make the sounds a failing wall made. It did not tell you in the dark hours how badly the cold was winning. She capped the ink. She folded the letter without finishing it and pressed it back into the mattress seam. Outside in the dark, her mother's hands did not stop moving. The scrape and knock of stone being set aside, the patient dismantling of 6 weeks of labor, the refusal of a 34-year-old widow to let the night convince her of what the morning might still disprove. Ingrid lay on her pallet and listened to those sounds and could not separate what she felt about them into anything clean or nameable. It was not admiration. It was not quite despair. It was the specific discomfort of watching someone you love do something that might be destroying them while being entirely unable to look away. The letter waited in the mattress. The decision waited with it. The cold was still months away, still gathering itself somewhere north of the Wyoming line, indifferent to the arguments being had on its behalf in Dunmore, indifferent to the arithmetic on Harlan Fitch's chalkboard, indifferent to whether Ezra Calloway shook his head or Maren Voss found her answer in time. It was coming regardless. The only question was whether when it arrived it would find a wall that knew how to answer it. The morning after the wall came down, Maren did not rebuild. She stood in the yard with a charred stick from the cold cook fire and walked the wet slope above Bitter Creek, marking the ground where the water had gone. The basin, had it been watching, would have added this to the long account of her foolishness, A woman standing idle in her ruined yard, with the freeze coming on, drawing marks in the dirt like a child making patterns. She knew it for the only honest work left to her. A wall could be raised in a week. Understanding where the land wanted to send its water took longer. It took looking instead of doing, and the skipping of that looking was precisely the error she had buried 6 weeks of her hands in. She followed the runoff down past the broken corner, past the place where Buck had refused to lie, all the way to a low seam in the earth she had never noticed, because she had never before been desperate enough to look. The ground sloped toward her foundation. Not dramatically, not the kind of slope a man standing upright would register without being told to look for it. But enough. The fort had been built by soldiers who had perhaps never seen a Wyoming August, men who understood sightlines better than drainage, who had placed their walls for defense against what came from outside, rather than for defense against what accumulated underneath. Every drop of rain that fell within 30 feet of the northern wall found its way home to that wall, found the ground there soft from the digging, found the new mortar uncured, found the joints between the lowest stones, and began the work that would finish in January. She knelt at the seam in the cold mud, with the truth of it arriving in her, like a stone dropped into still water, the ripples spreading outward to touch everything. She thought she had already understood. The people beneath her ruined fort had not failed because their principle was wrong. They had failed because they loved the rock and ignored the water, and water did not care how much anyone loved the rock. Heat and stone were old allies. Water was a third party that answered to neither, befriending stone in summer, betraying it in the killing freeze, prying open every joint that love and mortar had closed. She had known this. Her father had taught her this, not in words, but in the careful way he maintained the drainage channels around his kilns, the particular attention he gave to ground slope before he poured a single foundation course. She had carried the lesson across 14 years of marriage without once applying it, because Henrik had built on level ground, and she had not needed it, and knowledge you do not need tends to go quiet in you until the moment you need it most. The trench came first this time, before a single stone went back, before she mixed a trowel of mortar, before she did anything else on Harrow Ridge. She dug a channel that wrapped the entire northern face and turned the gathering bowl into a shedding slope. She cut it wide, lined the bottom with crushed shale and broken rock, so the water would have a dry road to travel even in the wettest weather, and directed the whole thing down toward Bitter Creek, where it belonged. The work took 4 days. It was invisible work. No stranger riding the creek road would have seen anything change above the rise. But Marin had stopped building for strangers. Otto appeared at the trench on the second morning without being summoned, dragging the rough sledge loaded with creek stone. His hands were wrapped in cloth strips because the rope handles had raised new blisters over the old ones, but he had wrapped them himself and said nothing about it because he had seen the corner fall and understood in his 9-year-old way that the thing they were doing now was different from the thing they had been doing before. Before they had been building. Now they were correcting, which was harder, which required a kind of stubbornness that blisters did not justify interrupting. He asked about everything. Why crushed shale at the bottom of the trench instead of packed clay? Why the channel angled slightly west before it turned toward the creek? Marin answered each question without impatience, the way her father had answered hers, not simplifying, not condescending, trusting the boy to hold whatever she gave him until the moment it made sense. Otto turned her answers over in his mind, the way he turned over the flat creek stones he collected, examining them from every side, storing them in whatever place a 9-year-old stores the things he doesn't yet fully understand but somehow knows he'll need. Ingrid did not come to the trench. She did the cooking, the washing, the mending, the work that had to be done regardless of whether any wall ever stood on Harrow Ridge again. She kept her distance with the self-contained deliberateness of someone who has made a private decision and is protecting it from interference. The letter was still in the mattress. She had not finished it, but she had not destroyed it either, and she was living in the narrow, uncomfortable space between those two facts. The mortar changed. This was the confession written in lime where no one but Marin would ever read it. More lime in the outer layer now, a harder shell against weather, a skin that would shed water rather than absorb it. The inner courses stayed softer, more yielding, built to move fractionally with the stone through the long, slow heave of the freeze-thaw cycle without cracking. A wall that could not flex would eventually shatter. A wall that flexed without limit would eventually collapse. The balance between rigidity and accommodation was the same balance required in most things that had to survive over time, and it was not a balance you could learn from a book or from watching other men work. It was something the wet summer had taught her by destroying what she had built before she understood it. When Otto asked why she didn't simply put the same stones back, the same way they had stood for 20 years before the rain, hadn't they? Marin pressed a trowel of the new mix into a joint and gave him the thing she had paid 6 weeks of ruined work to know. Stone can hold warmth. Her voice matter-of-fact, the way she stated things that were simply true. But if it holds water, winter will split it open like a green log thrown on a hot fire. The boy turned the sentence over, filed it away, kept hauling. By the time the repaired corner had cured under the hardening September sun, it looked no different from the one that had failed. A stranger riding past would have seen the same low wall, the same widow's folly, with no visible evidence that anything had changed. The difference lived entirely underground in the trench, in the slope, in the reformed mortar, in the invisible corrections that Myron had bought with the most expensive tuition available on the Wyoming frontier, which was the cost of being wrong once in a country that generally did not offer a second chance. Buck came back to the rebuilt section on the third dry afternoon. He lowered his nose along the new joint, breathed in the lime and the shale and the dry earth, then circled once the slow, deliberate circle of a dog settling for the long haul, and lay down against the mended stone and stayed. He had refused the broken corner. He chose the corrected one. Marin watched from across the yard with a trowel in her hand and said nothing because there was no one to say it to who would have believed her, and because the only verdict she had any real faith in now was delivered by a creature who could not lie to flatter her and had no reason to wound her. The roof was the stage that convinced the last skeptics she had truly gone mad, and it convinced them because she built down where every soul in Greystone Basin built up. Settlers raised their roofs toward the sky, pine rafters, wood shingles, steep pitch, to shed the snow high enough to let a man stand under his own ridgepole with room to spare. It was the shape everyone knew, the shape children drew on school slates, the shape that said shelter in the only architectural language the basin had ever spoken. Myron laid heavy cottonwood beams flat across the opening of the fort beams, thick as a man's thigh, cut from the big trees along the creek bottom, hauled up the slope with a borrowed ox, and a great deal of effort, set close enough together to carry a weight no cabin roof had ever been asked to bear. Over the beams went a lattice of dried sage woven tight. Over the lattice went prairie grass packed down in a dense layer. Then came the sod, 14 inches of it, cut from the slope, and heavy black bricks of root and earth. Two-handed weights hauled up the rise and fitted edge to edge, course on course, until the house wore the hillside on its back, the way certain old creatures carry their shelter with them everywhere they go, as though the distinction between the animal and its protection had never been particularly meaningful. From the creek road below, the structure no longer looked like a building. It looked like a place where the land had considered rising up into the air and then, exercising better judgment, had decided to stop just short of the surface. A swell in the earth, a held breath in the ground. Sprague came out specially to observe the sod going on. He returned to Dunmore with a new line about how the widow had finally found a roof that matched her house since both of them belonged in the same location. The basin laughed most of it anyway. A few of the women in the general store did not, and a few of the men looked at their boots for a moment before they joined in, which was a different thing from laughing freely, though it looked the same from a distance. Ingrid helped with the sod. She told herself it was only because the work required more hands than were available, which was true. She told herself it meant nothing about her opinion of the project, which was less true. Somewhere in the lifting and carrying and fitting of heavy earth bricks, in the shared exhaustion of it, in the rhythm that develops between two people working the same hard task. Her certainty developed a hairline crack she did not announce to anyone, least of all herself. When the last brick was fitted and she stood inside the finished space beneath 14 inches of earth, with the late September heat shut out as completely as though a door had been closed on summer itself, she felt something she had no name for and did not want to name. The room was cool in a way that had nothing to do with cross-ventilation or shade. It was cool the way the inside of the earth is cool steadily, absolutely without the cooperation of wind or the mercy of cloud cover. If it could hold the August heat out that thoroughly, she understood with a slow turning in her chest that she was working to suppress it, could hold the January cold out by the same principle. She did not say this aloud. She went back outside and carried more sod bricks. The hearth was the decision that looked most like madness from the outside, which meant it was the decision that mattered most. Every family in Greystone Basin placed their stove in the center of the room where the heat could radiate outward in all directions, a sun at the center of a small domestic solar system. It was the obvious arrangement, the intuitive one, the one that maximized the feeling of warmth in the immediate vicinity of the fire. Marin built her hearth against the inner face of the northern wall, the coldest wall, the wall the winter would press hardest against the wall that faced the Wyoming line and everything that came down from it. She built it of fitted stone directly against the masonry so that every fire she ever lit would push its warmth backward into the 2 feet of fitted rock. Before it gave anything to the air would feed the wall first. The way a careful person makes the investment before the expenditure, putting heat by against a colder hour rather than spending it all in the moment of warmth. It was a decision that looked like selfishness toward the family, toward the children who needed warmth tonight. It looked like wisdom only to someone willing to be colder in October, so that she might be warm at all in February, to someone who had learned to think in seasons rather than evenings, who had done the arithmetic on the back of a seed catalog, and understood that the debt a bad house ran up in wood and sleep, and the slow grinding down of a family's hope, was a debt that never got retired, no matter how much you paid against it. Calloway heard about the hearth placement from Fitch, who had heard it from the man who delivered the ox. He stopped his horse on the road below Harrow Ridge and looked up at the finished structure for a long moment. The sod roof, the low profile, the way the whole thing hunkered against the hillside, as though it had grown there rather than been built. His craftsman's eye moved over it involuntarily, reading what it could read from the road, finding the things it was looking for, and not finding them. Finding instead things it had not expected. He rode on without stopping. That night in his own cabin, built by his own best hands, as tight a structure as Greystone Basin contained, he lay awake for a while longer than usual. The fire was good, well banked, the kind of fire a man who understood fires built when he intended to sleep through without rising. He lay in the warmth of it and thought about the hearth placement, and could not try, as he honestly tried, find the argument against it that he felt certain existed somewhere just beyond his reach. He was still thinking about it when he finally slept. The thought waited for him when he woke. October came in hard, the first cold nights arriving without the usual gradual transition, as though the season had skipped the formality of autumn and moved directly to its real intentions. Frost appeared along Bitter Creek before sunrise, and the children's breath hung white in the doorway of a morning. The families of Greystone Basin began their familiar winter preparations. The stacking of wood, the re-chinking of walls, the dragging of extra blankets from summer storage, the particular focused anxiety of people who know exactly what is coming and are not entirely certain they have done enough to meet it. Marin hung 2 thermometers, one near the door where the cold pressed hardest, one against the northern wall beside the hearth where the warmth was stored. On the shelf beside them, she placed a small notebook, thin pages, bought with money that might have bought flour, and she understood the trade clearly when she made it. Every day she wrote in it, temperature at sunset, temperature before dawn, wood consumed through the day and night counted in sticks, with the precision of someone who had learned the hard way that estimates were a luxury unavailable to people operating on margins this thin. Duration of the coal bed after the flames died, where Buck chose to sleep. Ingrid found her at the notebook one evening, bent over it in the lamplight, recording the dog's chosen corner with the same careful hand she gave the temperature readings, and the girl's voice carried more puzzlement than judgment. "You're keeping records of the dog now." Marin did not look up from the page. Her pencil continued its steady movement. "A dog does not flatter a wall." She went on writing, and the sentence stayed with Ingrid long after she meant to have forgotten it, turning in her mind through the lengthening nights, because there was a kind of sense buried in it that she could feel without being able to excavate, the sense that a creature with nothing to prove and no opinion to defend might know a truer thing about warmth than all the men in Dunmore with their figures and their certainty and their slow authoritative headshakes. 3 weeks of those pages built a pattern invisible to anyone standing on the creek road. On several nights, the outside thermometer fell to 12 degrees, hard cold, the kind that killed stock left unprotected, the kind that found every gap in every wall in the basin and walked right through it. The inside reading held above 48. The fire often shrank to coals before midnight, the flames long gone, and yet the temperature inside did not drop the way it dropped in a pine cabin the moment the wood burned through. It declined slowly, a degree at a time, an hour at a time. The wall paying back through the long night what the fire had put into it through the evening, returning heat on its own schedule, a ledger settling its accounts in the dark hours while the family slept. Marin read those numbers each morning before the children woke alone with the notebook in the cold dawn outside the door. She felt no triumph. Triumph required an audience, and she had none. She felt something older than triumph, something that lived below the level of satisfaction, the ground under her wager going solid. Her father's lessons proving themselves true 1,000 miles from the Kansas limestone country, where he had first pressed a small girl's hand against a dead kiln's warm flank and taught her that the world could hold more than its surface suggested. The bucket told its own story. Through weather that would have skinned it over with gray ice by morning the previous winter, the water near the inside wall stayed clear and liquid, dipping clean into the kettle without the crack and break of frozen surface that had started every cold morning in the old cabin. The butter in its wooden bowl took the press of her thumb and gave without having to be thawed by the fire first. Small things, the kind of things no man in Dunmore would ever see or believe. That suited her now because she had stopped collecting evidence to win an argument. She was collecting evidence for Winter, the only judge whose verdict had ever truly mattered. Buck changed his habits as the nights deepened, and his change was the clearest entry in the notebook, though only Marin could read it. In the old cabin, he had pressed himself against the hearthstones every night, sleeping so close to the coals that his coat carried the smell of smoke into the mornings, driven there by the simple animal logic of a creature who takes warmth where he can find it or suffers the alternative. In the stone house, he began to stretch out several feet from the fire against the inner face of the southern wall, where the day's gathered warmth lingered through the dark hours like a breath held patiently against release. His loose, comfortable body communicated something that no column of numbers could quite articulate. An animal does not lie about where the warmth is. He has no reason to. Night after night, he chose the patient stone over the dying fire, and Marin marked each choice in the notebook and read his sleeping body the way a person reads something they have been waiting a long time to see confirmed. Ingrid did not open the notebook. She was not ready. She lived in the careful distance between the letter in her mattress and the observable fact that she was sleeping without her coat for the first time since the previous October, and she was not yet willing to let those two things occupy the same thought. She noticed things anyway. She noticed that the ache she had carried in her jaw through the two worst winters, that deep cold ache, she had assumed was simply what winter felt like, what it would always feel like, what she had resigned herself to as the permanent texture of cold season life was absent. She noticed that the corners of the room, which in the old cabin had been a different country from the warm center, a hostile territory that punished a person for straying 4 feet from the fire, were simply part of the room now. Same temperature everywhere. Same still air. The unity of it was strange, almost suspicious, like a negotiation where the other party gives too much. She noticed Otto sleeping sprawled under a single blanket, arms loose, face slack, the body language of a child who has not been cold in weeks. She had spent 2 winters watching her brother sleep curled tight as a question mark, his knees to his chest, trying to make himself small enough to hold his own warmth. The sight of him sprawled and at ease in a Wyoming October night made something move in her chest that she refused to identify. She did not open the notebook, but she stopped carrying the letter in her coat pocket, which she had been doing since September without quite noticing it. She left it in the mattress where it had always been. That was not a decision. It was the absence of a decision, which was a different thing, though from the outside they looked the same. The first real test of Calloway came not from the widow's wall, but from his own. November brought a cold front that was not the worst of what Wyoming could do that would come later, but was enough to strip the comfortable assumptions off a man who had built his reputation on the soundness of pine joinery. 3 nights running, Calloway rose before dawn to bank the fire, rose again an hour later, and again after that until sleep came only in the bitter intervals between wood runs, an old man shuffling through his own house in the dark, with an armload of split cottonwood, fighting a fight he had fought every winter for 15 years without ever quite winning it. On the 4th night, he gave up on sleep entirely and sat before the struggling fire with his hands held out to the heat, watching the cold creep back from the corners of the room the moment the fire's radius of warmth fell short of the walls. His cabin was the best-built structure in Greystone Basin. He had chosen every log himself over a full season, rejecting the green ones, the twisted ones, the ones with hidden rot at the core. He had chinked and rechinked every fall without fail. The joints in his corners were as tight as any he had ever cut, as tight as anything in the territory. None of it, not a single board foot of his craft, or his care, or his quarter-century of experience, could negotiate one additional degree of warmth out of a November night that had decided what it was going to do. A memory came up in the struggling firelight. He had spent 10 years burying it, had buried it so thoroughly that on most days he could not have told you exactly where he had put it, only that it was down somewhere deep, and he was not going to the trouble of digging it back up. It came up anyway, the way buried things do, when the conditions are right, when a man is alone in the cold at 4 in the morning, and the fire is losing, and there is nothing between him and the truth of it but the willingness to keep not looking. He had built a house once in his first hungry years as a young carpenter, certain of his craft and his future. A good house, the best work his young hands had ever done. Every joint clean, every log sound, the chinking packed tight, the roof pitched true. He had built it for a young wife, and the daughter she carried been proud of it, the way a young man is proud of the first real thing his hands have made, the thing he believes will stand between the people he loves and the hard world. The first winter, it had not been enough. A cold had come down patient and total and without mercy, and his daughter, not yet 2 years old, just learning to say his name, had taken a chill in a house he had sworn was tight. The chill became a cough. The cough became a fever. He had fed that fire all night, the whole length of a night that felt like several nights stacked together had burned through his woodpile in a focused fury, and none of it had mattered in the way that mattered most. His daughter had died in her mother's arms 4 feet from the fire. He could not stop feeding in a house that was alive with warmth only where the flames reached and cold everywhere the flames did not. He had never told anyone in Greystone Basin. His wife had followed 2 years later, and he had come west alone and built a reputation out of his grief and his craft, using the certainty that the grief had hardened in him, that if his best work could not save his own child, then no clever notion from anyone else could save theirs. As a kind of law he administered without partiality over every hopeful scheme that came before him. Sitting alone with the failing fire, he saw it clearly for what it was. Not wisdom, not experience. A father's terror dressed in a craftsman's coat and calling itself expertise, shaking its head at every widow and every dreamer who crossed his path, because the only alternative was to ask the question he had never allowed himself to ask, whether his daughter had died. Not because of any failure in his hands, but because the thing itself. The wooden house, the only answer anyone in his world had ever offered to the cold, simply could not do what a family needed it to do. His perfect pine walls were losing the same fight tonight that they had lost the night his daughter died. Somewhere across the basin on the rise above Bitter Creek, a widow's pile of stone was perhaps not losing it at all. The thought was unbearable in the specific way that thoughts are unbearable when they arrive too late to change the most important thing they are about. He sat with it in the dark for a long time without moving. He did not weep, not yet. He was not a man who wept easily, and the weeping would wait for a frozen wall in a blizzard that had not yet arrived. But the certainty that had served as the architecture of his inner life for 10 years developed in the failing firelight of that November night, a crack as real as the one that had opened in Marin Voss's north corner after the August rain. Cracks do not announce themselves. They do not ask permission. They only wait for the weight that will finish them. He did not ride out to Harrow Ridge. A man does not surrender a decade of grief armored as wisdom on the strength of a single sleepless night. The morning came and the doubt seemed like weakness, and he shook it off or tried to, in the way a man tries to shake off a truth that has found its way in through a gap he did not know was there. He could not entirely manage it. He found in the days after that he could not quite join Sprague's jokes, could not quite add his weight to Fitch's arithmetic, could not quite produce the slow headshake that the men at the feed store had come to expect from him as the definitive verdict on the widow's project. He began almost against his will to watch the smoke that rose from the rise above Bitter Creek on cold mornings. Thin, steady, unhurried, the smoke of a fire that was not fighting for its life. He watched it for a long time before he let himself think about what it meant. Ingrid opened the notebook on a night in late November when the wind outside had risen to a sound that strips a person's composure down to its last layer, a sustained pressurized howl that had been going for 6 hours and showed no sign of finishing its business with the Wyoming plain. She opened it not because she had changed her mind. She opened it because she wanted some reason, any reason, to believe in the walls around her, And the notebook was the only reason available that did not require her to simply trust her mother on faith. She read it the way Marin had taught her to read everything without the prior commitment to a conclusion, letting the numbers speak in whatever direction they chose to speak. Temperature at sunset. Temperature before dawn. The gap between the outside column and the inside column, which widened as the nights deepened, but never crossed into the territory that the old cabin had crossed on an ordinary November evening. She read about Buck's sleeping positions. She read the entry where Marin had noted the butter keeping without the fire, the water staying liquid through a night that had frozen the creek at the surface. She read the careful wood consumption tallies, sticks per day, sticks per night, the total across each week, and she understood what she was reading because she had spent 2 winters in a house that ate wood the way a drowning man drinks air, and the numbers in the notebook were not those numbers. She read to the last entry without stopping. Outside, the wind continued its long argument with the Wyoming plain. Inside, the air was still. The fire had burned down to coals 2 hours ago, and the temperature had dropped perhaps 2 degrees in those 2 hours, which was not the cliff drop she knew from the old cabin, which was not the bottom falling out of the world the moment the wood burned through. It was a slope, gentle, managed. The wall was paying something back. She set the notebook on the table. She did not immediately feel anything she could name. What she felt was the slow, reluctant withdrawal of a particular kind of despair. Not optimism replacing it, not hope rushing in to fill the vacancy, but simply the despair becoming less certain of itself, less able to hold its ground against what the numbers said. The town in her mind, the brick streets, the colored glass in the church window, the clean floor of her Aunt Ruth's parlor with its reliable warmth, that town did not disappear. But it lost some of its power over her. It became less like salvation and more like escape, and she had been raised in a country where people who ran from problems generally found the problems faster on their feet than they could run. She did not tear up the letter. She was not ready to be that definitive. But she left the notebook on the table where her mother had placed it instead of closing it and putting it back on the shelf. And that small failure to erase her own reading of it was, she supposed, as close to a statement as she was prepared to make. The Arctic front arrived without the courtesy of a warning. Not as a storm a man could see building on the western horizon, not as the iron smell in the wind that usually gave the basin half a day to prepare. It arrived as a fact the way a verdict arrives when the jury has already decided and the reading of it is merely a formality. Between supper and midnight on the 28th of December, 1883, the temperature in Greystone Basin dropped 30 degrees. By the time the gray, reluctant light came up the following morning, the thermometer at the postal station north of Dunmore read 34 below zero, a number that traveled cabin to cabin faster than any horse carried by the men who had dared the cold to check their stock, arriving at every door with the expression of someone delivering news they wished they did not have to deliver. The cottonwoods along Bitter Creek cracked in the dark with reports like rifle shots, the sap freezing solid, bursting the wood from within the trees, destroying themselves from the inside out with no external cause. Families who had been sleeping woke, reaching for weapons before their minds caught up to the sound. Fence lines that had stood plain at supper time were gone by dawn, buried under drifts that had not existed the evening before. The wind drove the loose snow off the frozen ground in long horizontal sheets that made the prairie indistinguishable from the sky, a white roaring sea with no floor, no ceiling, no horizon, no landmark by which a man might know where he was or in which direction safety lay. By the second day, no one in Greystone Basin was arguing about building methods anymore. The jokes did not merely quiet, they vanished the way the fence lines had vanished, swallowed whole without a trace. Winter had taken the chair at the head of the table, and Winter did not care what any man had believed in September, whose head had shaken, whose figures had tallied. The name Voss's icebox disappeared from the feed store and the general store and every supper table in Dunmore, not out of any mercy or second thought, but simply because every man who had laughed it was now too busy fighting for his own family's warmth to spare the breath for mocking another's. The familiar disasters came for the basin all at once. Stoves that had seemed generous in November ate wood at a rate that turned frightening within hours and desperate within a day. Great wood piles that had looked like a whole winter's supply in the autumn sun began to shrink with a speed that made families recalculate, then recalculate again, each new calculation worse than the last. Frost climbed the inside of every window, and grew back thicker within the hour of scraping. Beds were dragged bodily to the centers of rooms away from the walls, where the cold pooled deepest. The dogs that had ranged freely through the easy autumn now crowded against every hearth in the valley, pressed flat to the warm stone in front of the fires, searching with their bodies for the single square foot of floor that would not take from them what the rest of the house was taking. Calloway's cabin was no exception. This was the thing that finished the crack that November had opened in him, not the widow's success, but his own failure, made undeniable across 3 nights of the worst cold in living memory. His joints were as tight as any in the territory. His logs had been selected over a full season. His chinking had been renewed 6 weeks before the front arrived. None of it, not one board foot of craft or care, could negotiate a single additional degree out of the air pressing against those walls. 3 nights running, he rose before dawn to feed the fire. Rose again an hour later, rose a third time until sleep existed only in the bitter fragments between wood runs. An old man carrying armloads of cottonwood through his own house in the dark, feeding a fire that took everything he gave it and handed back less than he needed. On the 4th night, he lay awake and did not get up. He let the fire burn down to coals. He let himself feel the cold gathering in the corners of the room, the same corners, the same cold, the same gathering, and he lay in it and let the truth he had been refusing since the spring arrive in him, fully and without further argument. His skill had never been enough. Not 10 years ago, not now. The finest wooden house in Greystone Basin lived hour to hour, warm only where the fire reached warm, only while it burned. And the moment it stopped burning, the cold came back from the corners where it had been waiting, with the patience of something that understood it would win eventually. He had spent 10 years calling that bitter limitation by the name of wisdom. The mare went through the fence on the 5th night of the front. He heard it, the particular sound of a board giving way, different from the cottonwoods cracking lower and closer, and he was up and dressed before his mind had fully assembled the situation. A good bay mare raised from a foal worth more to his operation than he would have said aloud to anyone. He knew before he got to the barn that she was gone. The drift that had been building against the fence line for 4 days had simply covered it, made it invisible to an animal moving blind in the dark, and she had walked through the boards as though they were not there, because buried under 3 feet of crusted snow, they effectively were not. The tracks were already filling when he brought the lantern out. Not quickly, the wind had dropped to a sustained moan rather than the earlier howl, but steadily the snow sifting down into each hoofprint with the indifferent efficiency of a country that did not keep records of the things that moved across it. A man with sense would have let her go, would have counted the loss, grieved it, appropriately stayed by his fire. Calloway had built sense into every structure he had ever raised in Greystone Basin, had preached it to every homesteader who asked his advice, had let it guide every professional judgment of his long career. He understood, saddling the second horse, that what he was doing now had nothing to do with sense. He had stood once in front of something he loved while the cold took it, feeding a fire that could not stop what was happening, unable to act, unable to do anything except witness. He was not going to stand in place again while the cold took something from him. Not if there was any alternative to standing in place. He rode out into a country that had erased itself. The landmarks he had navigated by for 15 years, the lightning-struck cottonwood at the creek, bend the particular rise of the land east of Harrow Ridge. The dark line of the tree break along the northern property boundary had been replaced by a uniform white that offered no information and no orientation. His horse moved half-blind, head low, pushing through the wind-driven snow by instinct rather than direction, and Calloway gave it its head because he trusted the animal's instincts more than his own eyes, which were streaming in the cold and showing him nothing useful in any direction. The cold got into him the way water enters a boat, with a slow leak at the edges first, then everywhere at once. His hands on the reins became a distant report from a part of his body he could no longer fully claim. His face had stopped reporting anything at all, gone to a stiff mask that registered the wind's pressure without transmitting its temperature. His thoughts came slower, which he recognized as dangerous, which was itself a thought that came slowly. Somewhere past the second ridge, with the light failing to a gray that barely qualified as light, and his body failing with it in ways that he was cataloging with the detached clarity of a man past a certain threshold of cold, Ezra Calloway understood that he had ridden his grief out into a storm that did not distinguish between grief and arrogance. It would take him as readily as it would have taken anyone. The horse stumbled in a hidden drift, lurched sideways, and Calloway came out of the saddle, more than he stepped down from it, his frozen legs folding wrong, his bare right hand thrown out to stop the fall. His palm landed flat against a stone wall. He knew what should happen. 50 years of Wyoming winters had taught him what stone did to skin, at 38 below zero. The savage, instantaneous theft. The way rock at that temperature drank warmth from a human hand, faster than the blood could replace it, punishing a man for touching it with the swift, impersonal efficiency of a country that had never promised to be survivable. He braced for it, his whole body clenched against the expected bite. It did not come. Under his cracked, barely feeling fingers, the southern face of Marin Voss's wall held something that should not have existed in that killing air. Something low patient, stubbornly alive. Not the heat of a fire, not the warmth of a living thing, but the memory of warmth, yesterday's gift from a sun that had set hours ago, stored in 2 feet of fitted stone, with the same faithfulness that a careful person stores what they know they will need. The rock did not take from him. It simply refused to take, refused to add its cold to his, refused to participate in the process of his dying. He pressed his palm harder against the stone, then his whole forearm slowly, the way a man touches a thing he cannot make himself believe even while he feels it. The understanding arrived in him without argument or intermediary, not as a thought he assembled from evidence, but as a knowledge his body received directly, the way the body receives certain truths that the mind has been too defended to accept. There was warmth in this wall. Yesterday's warmth, held through the night, offered back to a freezing carpenter who had spent a summer telling the woman who built it that she was wrong. He found the door by moving along the wall with his shoulder, and he knocked with a fist that barely made a sound against the heavy timber. When the door opened, no furnace blast of desperate heat rolled out to meet him. What met him in the doorway was simply steady air, air that did not move, that carried no draft, that held its temperature the way a room holds a secret. The absence of the desperate warmth he had expected shook him nearly as much as the warm wall had. He had braced for the close heat of a family burning everything they owned to hold the dark at bay. Instead, he found a household that appeared to have declined the fight entirely. Ingrid looked up from the table where she was cutting bread for the morning, took in the ice-bearded man filling the doorway, and went back to her bread. Not rudely, with the untroubled practicality of someone for whom the temperature of the room was not a matter of current anxiety. Otto sat cross-legged on the floor, working a stiff leather strap between his small hands, absorbed in his task. Buck lifted his head from his place along the inner face of the southern wall, well away from the hearth, regarded the visitor with the mild interest of an animal, too comfortable to feel threatened, then laid his chin back on his paws and closed his eyes. Calloway's gaze moved through the room the way it always moved through structures, hunting by long habit for the lie in it, the trick, the hidden cost that must be there somewhere in anything that seemed too good to be true. The water bucket near the wall stood clear and dark and unfrozen. The thermometer by the door held a number he looked at twice. The fire in the hearth burned low against the northern stone, modest, unhurried, not the desperate roaring fight he had maintained for 4 nights in his own superior cabin. Then he saw the woodpile. After 5 days of the worst front in Greystone Basin's recorded memory, against a cold that had driven every family in the valley to burn through their winter supply. At panic rates, most of the Voss woodpile stood neat against the wall, untouched, more than half remaining. The sight of it hit him with the force of a specific, irreversible wrongness, the wrongness of a man who has built his professional identity on knowing exactly how much fuel a Wyoming winter demands of a house, confronting numbers that his entire career said were impossible. Marin stood across the room with her hands folded in her apron. She offered him nothing, no triumph, no speech, no told you so. The room itself was making her argument better than her mouth ever could, and she had learned in April with 3 men on horseback that a wise person steps aside and lets evidence do what evidence does. Calloway cleared his throat. The frost in his beard cracked and fell onto his coat. The only question left that mattered to a man who had fed his own losing fire for 4 nights running was the one he asked, how much wood? It was barely a sentence. 3 words. The distillation of a season's worth of argument down to the only measurement that told the truth. Marin crossed the room to the shelf, took down the small worn notebook, placed it in his half-frozen hands without a word. He worked the cover open with fingers that answered him imperfectly, and he read, dates in her careful hand running from the first frost through the present night. Outside temperatures at sunset and before dawn, the killing numbers dropping column by column as December deepened. Beside them, the inside readings declining slowly, maintaining a margin against the cold that his own well-built cabin had not maintained. Wood consumed each day counted in sticks. The total across 5 days of the worst front any living person in the basin could remember. He read it standing with the cold still pouring off his coat, melting in a dark pool around his boots. And he read it the way Ingrid had read it, not looking for the flaw, not searching for the argument against it, but letting it say what it said and accepting what it said as true. By the time he lowered the notebook, the long structure of his certainty, 10 years in the building, mortared with grief and professional pride, and the defensiveness of a man who has made his sorrow into a law, was simply gone. Not crumbled. Gone. The way a thing disappears when you finally understand it was never true to begin with. He stayed the night because no man rode out again into what lay beyond that door, not in that condition, not in that cold. Later, when the children were asleep and the fire had settled further into its patient coal breathing, Calloway looked into the low glow for a long time before he spoke. When he did, his voice was flat and quiet, the voice of a man who has stopped managing what he sounds like. I built a house once, best work my hands had ever done. Every joint clean, every log sound. First winter, my daughter took a chill in it. She was not yet 2. Marin set down her mending. She did not offer comfort because she understood this was not the kind of telling that wanted comfort, it wanted a witness. He told it through to the end, the cough and the fever, the night he fed the fire, until there was nothing left to feed it with, and it had not mattered. The 2 years after in the coming West, and the way he had converted the grief into a professional principle and administered that principle over 15 years of other people's hopeful schemes. I shook my head at you all summer to keep your children from freezing. His voice carried no score-keeping against himself, only the flat recognition of a man finally looking clearly at something he had long refused to look at. While you were the only soul in this basin who had found the way to keep them warm, Marin let that sit in the air for a moment. You couldn't have known what nobody taught you. Her voice carried nothing sharp, no score to settle. My father taught me. That's the only difference between us. Something in the old carpenter's face shifted in the firelight, not resolved, not healed, but rearranged. A weight that had been distributed unevenly for a decade, finding a slightly better balance. He slept that night against the warm stone wall, the first full night's sleep he had managed in a week, and the stone held its warmth around him, with the same patience it had held everything else, asking nothing, offering what it had stored. The front broke on the morning of the 2nd of January the way it had arrived all at once without transition. The wind simply stopped between 1 hour and the next, and the silence that replaced it was so complete and so sudden that families across the basin stepped outside into it with the uncertain expression of people who do not quite trust a peace that arrived without negotiation. The sky scrubbed itself to a blue so absolute it seemed to go up forever, and the snow lay still and blinding under it, and the sun came back with a warmth too thin to do much work, but enough to remind the basin that warmth was still an option. The families of Greystone Basin dug out. They counted what 5 days had cost them. Then they did what people in that country always did after a hard season, which was to gather and compare their survivals and decide together what the experience had meant. The feed store filled on the 4th day of the thaw. Ruddy faces, frost-chapped hands, the particular relief of people who have come through something they were not entirely certain they would come through, and are glad to be in a room together talking about it, rather than alone in a cabin not talking about it. The conversation ran to lumber and spring repairs to the cabins that had failed outright and would need rebuilding to the woodpiles that had come far too close to empty for anyone's comfort. Harlan Fitch stood near the counter in his good coat, already calculating and board feet finding, as he always found the commercial opportunity nested inside the disaster. Calvin Sprague saw his opening and took it because Calvin Sprague was a man who could not resist an opening. Well now, his voice carrying its practiced ease. I suppose the Voss place didn't freeze solid after all. A few men produced the beginning of a laugh. It died in the middle of itself, half-formed, because every man in that warm store had just spent 5 nights feeding fires that could not keep up with the dark, had seen his own breath inside his own house, had watched his woodpile shrink towards zero with a speed that had genuinely frightened him. The joke had a different flavor now, laced with something the autumn version had not contained, the aftertaste of a winter that had just demonstrated without any ambiguity exactly what the cold could do to a wooden house and the family inside it. The door opened before the failed laugh had fully settled, letting in a blade of bright cold air. Calloway came in stamping snow from his boots, unwinding his scarf. The men turned to him with the automatic attention they had given him for 15 years, waiting for the verdict, the slow, measured statement that would set the matter straight, the professional assessment that would let them understand what they had just been through and where to place it. Calloway crossed the room. He was not a man who made speeches had never been, and he did not make one now. What he said was simple, specific, delivered in the same level voice he used when he was telling a man something true about his roof. Any man in this room thinking of building north of the basin come spring ought to ride out and put his bare hand on that woman's wall before he orders so much as a single board from Harlan Fitch's yard. The store went quiet in the particular way rooms go quiet when the ground shifts under something people have been standing on without knowing they were standing on it. Fitch's arms folded across his chest, the gesture of a man hearing the thing he sells called into doubt by the one voice that could make the doubt stick. You're saying stone beats pine, you of all men in this territory. Calloway turned to the frosted window and looked out at the winter that still lay white and unbroken across the valley, at the evidence written in every drift, every buried fence line, every woodpile that had come frighteningly close to empty across 5 days that were not even the worst Wyoming could produce. He turned back. The cold does not care what I used to believe. His voice left no room for the statement to be softened or argued around. It arrived as what it was, the plainest possible account of what the evidence had told him. Nobody laughed after that. Not Sprague, not anyone. The silence that followed was the particular silence of men recalibrating, not cheerfully, not with any eagerness to have been wrong, but with the honest reluctance of people who have been shown something they cannot responsibly ignore. Questions began to replace the ridicule slowly, one at a time. How thick were the walls exactly? How had she carried that roof without the pitch collapsing under the snow's weight? How much wood truly across the full 5 days? One of the younger settlers, warming to the topic with the enthusiasm of someone discovering that the thing everyone told him was foolish, was not foolish, proposed that they might call it a Calloway wall, a tribute to the man whose word had made it real in the basin's understanding, whose endorsement had given it the authority to be taken seriously. Calloway heard the proposal for what it was beneath the kindness, the basin's oldest habit, the unconscious redistribution of a woman's work into a man's name, the way the frontier had always handled ideas that arrived from directions it hadn't expected. He would not hold it. He had taken enough from Maren Voss across one long summer, her standing her neighbor's trust, the easy goodwill that the basin might have offered her, if his head shaking had not converted curiosity into contempt. He was not going to take this last thing too. It is not a Calloway wall. His flat voice closed the space around the sentence before anyone could argue through it. It is a Voss wall. I am only the man who was wrong about it the longest. The name settled into the quiet of that store and stayed. The men received it in the silence it deserved, and from that day forward through the rest of that winter, through the springs and summers and hard winters that followed, it was the Voss wall in every mouth in Greystone Basin. Because the one man who might most easily have taken the credit for it, whose name would have carried the idea further and faster than hers, could in that particular world had refused the credit out loud before witnesses and named the truth instead. Ingrid took the letter out of the mattress seam on a warm evening in late March, when the windows could be left open to the first real air of the year, the air that smells of mud and melt and the specific aliveness of ground returning to itself after months of cold. She unfolded it and read the salutation. Dear Aunt Ruth, and the date from August, in the single sentence beneath it about not lasting the winter. She read it with the strange double vision of looking back across a distance you have traveled without fully noticing you were traveling. The girl who had written it was not wrong exactly. She had written from what she knew at the time, which was a cabin that couldn't keep the cold out, a mother's project that the entire valley had condemned, a future that seemed to narrow to a point whenever she tried to look at it clearly. That girl had not been a fool. She had been someone learning, which was a different thing, and the learning had cost her something, the way all real learning costs something. She did not burn the letter. Burning it would have meant the girl who wrote it had been foolish, and her mother had taught her, without ever sitting her down to teach her, without any lecture or speech, that a person who learns a hard thing the hard way was never a fool for not having known it sooner. She folded it small and put it in the cedar box where she kept the things worth keeping. A record of a place she had passed through, a marker for the journey. What she did not keep was the plan the letter contained. By that spring, Ingrid was the one who answered the door when neighbors rode up the slope to ask their questions. She explained the drainage trench and the mortar composition and the reason the hearth belonged against the cold wall rather than the center of the room. She explained it with the quiet authority of someone who had doubted every word she was now saying, had doubted it completely, had kept an escape letter in her mattress against the possibility that the whole enterprise would fail, and had been brought around not by argument or persuasion, but by a winter that did not negotiate. She explained it the way her mother had always explained things, by showing, not by claiming. She took visitors to the northern wall and pressed their hands against the stone on a cold morning and let the warmth stored there since yesterday's fire speak for itself. Most of them did not say anything for a moment. Most of them had the same expression Marin had worn when she first pressed her palm to the sun-warmed southern face on that April afternoon a year ago, the expression of a person discovering that the world holds more than its surface suggests. Through that spring, the thinking spread, the way ideas spread on the frontier, person to person, hand to hand, one neighbor pointing another to a south wall that gathered the afternoon warmth, a father showing a son how a hearth could share its heat with the masonry rather than flinging it all up the flue. It was not the house itself that spread, because most families in Greystone Basin had no ruined army fort on their land. What spread was lighter than stone. What spread was the understanding beneath the house, the recognition that warmth was not something a family had to fight for every single night, paying the debt over again from darkness to darkness, but something that could be stored, held, trusted to remain through the long hours when the fire burned low. New cabins that went up in the summer of 1884 crouched lower than the ones before them. Their north walls were thicker, reinforced with fieldstone hauled from the hills. Their roof lines were modest, drawn down toward the holding earth. Their hearths were built against the cold-facing walls, rather than the centers of the rooms, the heat going into the stone first, and into the air second, the investment made before the expenditure. Calloway taught it not because he claimed the principle as his own, but because he gave it back correctly, labeled every single time. And a principle that carries the right name is a principle that carries the truth of its origin. One afternoon in late April, Marin was on the rise, repairing a small new crack in the northern wall, the kind of minor seasonal adjustment that stone construction required, the natural consequence of a first hard winter, working through the masonry and teaching it where it needed to give. She was working fresh mortar into the seam with her thumb when she heard a wagon slow on the creek road below. A man she half knew climbed down and came up the slope. He had the look of someone who had prepared questions, which he then asked, the same questions everyone came to ask now, where once they had only come to watch. She answered the ones worth answering, then turned back to the crack in the wall, because the work did not stop for being admired, and admiration had never been the point. Below on the road, Otto was explaining something to the man's son, a boy about Otto's age who had climbed down from the wagon seat and was examining the base of the wall with the serious attention of a child encountering something genuinely new. Otto's voice carried the energy of someone sharing knowledge he has not yet had long enough to take for granted, explaining the drainage trench and the slope of the land with the enthusiasm of someone who remembers learning it and wants the learning to continue outward into the world. Buck slept in a patch of strong April sun a few feet off, boneless and content, stretched flat against the warming stone of the southern wall. The stone under him had been gathering the morning sun for 3 hours. It would hold that warmth into the evening, into the night, long past the moment the sun moved on to other business. That was what stone did, given time, given patience, given a person willing to trust it with the long hours. Marin pressed her thumb into the fresh mortar, smoothed it flat, sat back on her heels and looked at the repaired seam. Clean, sound. The kind of correction that becomes invisible once it sets indistinguishable from the original work, holding against whatever came next, with the same quiet refusal to yield that the rest of the wall had demonstrated through a winter, that the basin would spend a generation measuring other winters against. Marin Voss never defeated the Wyoming winter. No one in that country ever had, and the few proud men who claimed to were always the ones the cold came for quietly in the end, while they were still certain they were winning. What she had done was a smaller thing, a more durable thing, a thing that outlasted the season it was built to answer. She had found a way to let yesterday itself stand watch over her sleeping children through the longest nights the North could produce, warming them with what the days before had given. The basin spent a generation learning to build the way a widow had built, who had only ever from the first stone to the last been trying to keep her family from waking up cold.